It's been great to get involved with some of Kevin's activities over the last couple of years that I've known him, since we met at church. And yeah, I can really see that Kevin's is plugged into something historic. I mean, there's no question that the Tea Party is becoming a historic phenomenon. And I speak with the perspective of history. I mean, I study history. And I can let you know that popular activism in the midterm election has had a lot of significant effect in recent American history. Popular activism actually very similar to what we've seen with the Tea Party. I mean, we just heard yesterday, that the president, in a desperate attempt to get the economy moving again, is going to sponsor something called an investment tax credit. You may have heard that on the news yesterday and today. He was on a John Deere or Ford tractor today. It was orange. And he was saying that he's going to sponsor an investment tax credit, and this is going to, because businesses can write off the price of their equipment, the economy will be sparked so that there's no reason to vote out the Democrats in November. Do you know that John F. Kennedy did exactly that same thing in October 1962? There had been 3 recessions in the past 8 years, in 1953, 1957, and 1960. And all the forecasters were saying, well, fella, there's going to be another one because your policy has the marginal rate of the income tax at 90%. And Kennedy, I don't know what to do about that. He's going to leave the income tax at the high taxes. He says, we're going to have an investment tax credit. Well, the Republicans made gains, even in the face of that investment tax credit. And Kennedy said, I'm not going to let that happen again, and I'm going to cut the marginal rate of the income tax by 21 points. And he made plans for that, and sure enough, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, was elected in a landslide in 1964. In 1978, Jimmy Carter was facing an economy that was beset by stagflation. Yeah, unemployment rate was 9%, just like it is today. And the inflation rate was 9%, leading to a misery index, add them both together, up to 18. The electorate said, this is crazy. You've got to have a tax cut, a real tax cut. He says, I'll just have a little fake tax cut. I'll just kind of have the kind of tax cut that the president now has. We'll increase the exemptions. And he passed that tax cut. The Republicans gained in 1978. And he did not do what John F. Kennedy did. He did not therefore come through with a real tax cut after 1978, and Ronald Reagan was ushered into office in 1980. And I'd say the same thing about 1994. The thing that I learned in writing the book Econoclasts, which is a history of the Reagan Revolution in economic policy, is that all economic growth that this country has experienced in the 20th century, at least since the founding of the income tax in 1913, all of it has been associated with tax cuts. There has never been economic growth in this country since the foundation of the income tax that was not associated with the restriction of that tax. There's not one episode. You could say, well, what about the Great Depression, when the marginal rate of the income tax went from 25 to 73? Well, the gross national product of this country was no larger in 1939 than it was in 1929. There wasn't any economic growth in the Great Depression. There was a huge collapse, and then people kind of dug back to the original level, but there wasn't any growth. Every single point of economic growth, virtually every single point of economic growth, since 1913, the year the income tax was founded, happened in the wake of tax cuts. Now, what I think has become painfully obvious to us in the past 2 years is that that record remains unbroken today. We haven't seen any real economic growth in the face of no tax cuts. What have we had the last 2 years? We've just had an increase in spending on the order of what, 1.5 trillion, 2 trillion perhaps, with the loose money. And economic growth doesn't exist. I mean, it barely clears the rate of population increase. So there hasn't been any economic growth. The only way we're going to get it is if there are tax cuts. Of course, there are tax increases on the horizon. What I'd like to do in my remarks to you is just kind of walk you through the 20th century, walk you through some of the history that I discussed in this book, culminating, of course, in the Reagan Revolution, and to point out that every single episode of economic growth since the foundation of the income tax in 1913 has occurred because of tax cuts. And every single time the economy has stalled, especially for a protracted period of time, there has been either a resistance to cutting taxes or taxes have been increased. The record is actually 100% clear. There are no exceptions. And it's this lesson that kind of has to be hammered home to our politicians. And the thing is, I'm afraid the politicians do really know this. I mean, even the Democrats know this. It just becomes so charged a political issue that they don't want to admit it. It's funny, Kennedy was one who understood, okay, tax cuts are a Republican issue, but I'm just going to do it because I want to succeed. And that's an option that the current incumbent president could pursue if he were really interested in success, but I'm not entirely sure he is. So what I'd like to do is simply discuss the economic history of this country since the most important year in this country's modern history. And I would like to argue that this country's most important year in its modern history was 1913. 1913, 97 years ago. I mean, we always hear about the other big years in American history. What, 1929 with the stock market crash, 1941, 45, the great World War II years, 1968, I guess, when they had stuff in Chicago, 1980, 1989 with Eastern Europe, 2001, September 11th. But I really do think that the most significant, the most transformative year in modern American history is 1913.